first as, or originally as Deputy Chair and now as Chair of the Species Survival Commission. And I don't know, who of you in this room have heard of the IUCN? Most of you, but not everyone. So very briefly, and Jon Paul can correct me if he thinks my interpretation is perhaps a little off, but the IUCN is sort of like the United Nations of conservation. It brings together governments and key stakeholders. Policies are decided upon, which have varying levels of impact, sometimes a very high level of impact, sometimes less so. So the 30 by 30 agreement and the new convention on or the new framework for out of the Convention on Biological Diversity is very much tied to the IUCN. And so it's very exciting to invite Jon Paul, given that in my role as the Olajos-Goslow Chair, I'm working hard to connect my global work in the policy realm, in the governance realm, in the management realm, to some of the issues facing the Colorado Plateau and the Southwest. And I also want to welcome our Environmental Science and Policy ENV 555 master students. I think great opportunity to learn from someone working at a very high level in global policy making. And so just before I hand over, a logistical matter. So after Jon Paul's talk, which will go for about 45 minutes, there'll be time for questions. And thereafter, we have some coffee, some drinks, and some snacks, and people can talk to Jon Paul some more. We can hang out. And thereafter, the ENV 555 students, myself and Prane and Jon Paul will go to a classroom and we'll have some more discussions there. And finally, just thank you before I hand over. Thank you to Marcia Olajos, whose kind gift to this chair and to NAU has made these sorts of events possible. And Laura Schmidt helped organize things and the catering. Emily Wren sitting there has been invaluable in just helping coordinate things. And Camille Gaillard is kindly managing our camera for today so that this can be put online nicely. Thank you. Without any further ado, Jon Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Duan. It's really a pleasure to be here. Actually, the IUCN is better than the UN. And the reason why it's better is because civil society is part of it and the UN is not. And that's a huge difference, as I will tell you in a few minutes. So I usually start these presentations with asking, who is united by IUCN? Who are we? What is it a union of? And there are three parts to IUCN. The first part are the member organizations. This is like the board of directors, if you want, of the union. It's the owners, the stockholders, the people who run the organization, who vote, who decide what gets done. We have meetings every 4 years. And those meetings are the World Conservation Congress. They're called since 1996, when the first one was in Montreal, and they happen every 4 years. Now, the really cool thing about IUCN is that you've got all these people together. So I've sat next to the US delegation is composed of professional bureaucrats, people who are involved with the State Department and other agencies, people who do this for a living, who are super experienced. And then next to them, you have people like my organization, 30 years ago, Provita, students who became a member of IUCN. And we have pretty much, indigenous people organizations, private sector representatives, and all of us have the same voice, practically the same voice. And it's really unique to be able to have this large conservation forum where people with such different experiences and different talents and so on sit together. So that's really very special. Then the IUCN has a professional staff, about 1,000 people distributed in many countries with all kinds of different arrangements. There's no single IUCN office model. And the group that I represent are the commissions. The commissions are about 15,000, 16,000 almost people who, I'm just going to put this here to remind me the time, who volunteer for the union. This is the brain trust of IUCN. These are people who have other professional lives. A lot of them come from academia, but they're also government, NGOs, etc. And these 15,000 plus people contribute, we estimate, in terms of their in-kind contribution to the union, something between $150 and $200 million a year in their time. So it's a really valuable resource for the IUCN. And these people these 7 commissions, we call them, the Species Survival Commission, which is the one that I chair, the World Commission on Protected Areas, the Commission on Education and Communication, WCL is the World Commission on Environmental Law, CEM is the Commission on Ecosystem Management, CESP is Environmental and Social Sciences, and the Climate Crisis Commission, which was just founded this year. Now, the kinds of things that we do as a union in the commissions specifically is to produce what we call knowledge products. You may have heard of the Red List of Threatened Species, which I will speak a little bit more about in a second. Then Protected Planet, which is the World Database of Protected Areas. KBAs is a standard key biodiversity areas, a joint product of SSC and WCPA, and so on. These are all tools that we produce, very influential tools on international policy that are used throughout the world. Now, in addition to these global standards, we also have national level standards. So these national red lists of species and ecosystems, KBAs, protected areas, also work at the national level. And for me, that's the real useful tool, and you'll see why in a second. So we have many countries of the world that have produced national red lists, and many that have produced national, of species and of ecosystems. Now imagine, I call it the Google map of biodiversity. So imagine the Google map of biodiversity, which is a database that integrates the 2 red lists, species and ecosystems, that any of you who manage databases knows that as long as 2 databases have 1 field in common, then they can be combined into a single relational database. And we can do that by using the same ecosystem classification for species and ecosystems. We can join those 2 databases. We can bring in the national species red list by using the same taxonomy. So the taxonomy of national and global red lists could be the same taxonomy. And then if we use the same habitat classification for the ecosystems, we can have a database that has all these data in a single place. Easy to do from a computer perspective. Now we put on top of that, or underneath that, however you look at it, protected areas, and then we put on top of that key biodiversity areas. Any of you in any jurisdiction, any spatial scale, could just draw a polygon on a map and then download the data on the species, ecosystem, degree of protection, key KBAs. That's doable. That's within our reach. That's for people work. I've spoken about this in Google and Microsoft, and these guys start yawning in a millisecond. They're just like, this is boring stuff. We used to do this 30 years ago. For them, technologically, it is not a challenge. For us, scientifically, it's a gigantic challenge, because people that work on species don't talk to those who work on ecosystems, and then they hate the people who work on KBAs and so on. So we have to work the human dimensions of science to be able to get this done. But we're working on it. And one of my goals is to have this Google map of biodiversity sometime soon, which we're calling now the IUCN map of biodiversity. Now, going back to this graph, we as commissions, we work really well with the secretariat, the professional staff. We do lots of stuff. We have a lot less engagement with IUCN member organizations, with governments, with NGOs. So that's another field that is a priority for us, is to strengthen the relationship between the science and IUCN and the implementers. And we'll see in a second also why that's so important. Now, this is a slide that you're not meant to really see in detail, but these are the logos of a lot of the specialist groups of the Species Survival Commission. Some of them are like corporate, design, premeditated. Some of them are like the daughter of the chair drew it on a napkin over breakfast one morning. And that's exactly the nature of our network. Very diverse, very heterogeneous, no single model, no top-down structure, very self-propelled and self-inspired. And that's a great thing. It's hard to manage, but it's a strength of a union, is that you have space to bring all your thinking. And my role is to be the cheerleader of all of these people. Just a few statistics about the union, about the commission. On the right there, you see a whole bunch of recently created groups, so you get a sense. We're always creating new groups. It's a big part of the process is to fill gaps in taxonomy, geography, and expertise. And a lot of them are vertebrates. We have a growing fungi, very active group, but you can see they cover all kinds of different taxonomic and disciplines. We don't only have these are what we call cross-cutting, are groups that are focused on a theme like climate change or conservation planning or reintroductions or so on. So lots of room for lots of different things. A lot of our membership is from Western Europe, though we have a hugely rapidly growing Asian membership group, and parts of the world like West Asia and Central Asia and Eastern Europe are still weak. And one of my priorities is to develop these regions as well. Now, the red list, this is what you see when you go to the website, which is redlist.org. Now, it's unfortunate that it's called that because it's not a list and it's not about threatened species. It is a database about species. There you can see on the left of your screen the classification of threatened species categories that we use. Those three in the middle, critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable, are what we call collectively threatened species under IUCN, and they get assigned following a protocol, a data system. You apply you gather some information on the species, and then you assign the category. But all the others are also part of the system, and species on the database are in all of those categories. As you would suspect, the majority of the species on our database correspond to least concern, LC, which is in IUCN jargon means not threatened. We call it least concern because it's a probabilistic terms. That means that all species have some risk of being at risk of extinction. So we call it least concern but the big contribution of IUCN to this is this classification system. It's a system that has a process and that everybody in the world uses very widely. Now, when you think of conservation priorities, what do we do with these data? How do we decide which species get invested on? Extinction risk is one criterion to assign priorities, but although extinction risk assessment is a scientific process, it's transparent, objective, repeatable, like any scientific process, priority setting is not. Priority setting is a social process. It's a lot messier, it's more subjective, it involves values, it involves lots of things. And what this graph tries to do is to illustrate that by seeing that when you decide how you invest money on species conservation, you think about, is it endemic to my country, distribution? Is it a umbrella species, biological factors? Do I like it? People like it, it's societal. Is it hard or easy to conserve, logistics? Do I have the money, economics, etc.? Lots of different attributes. And what I encourage people to do is not to pretend that priority setting is scientific and objective, but to be transparent about what criteria they use. So you can use any of these or more or fewer, but then be explicit. Say, my value scale is that I focus on extinction risk, distribution, and economics, for example. And you pick whatever you want, but then be transparent, be explicit about what are your preferences. As an example, I have this, this is the national bird of Venezuela, where I'm from, and it is not threatened. It is least concern both in the national red list and the global red list, but it is a conservation priority. It has nothing to do with extinction risk. It is a conservation priority because it is the national bird of Venezuela. So there's no relation between one and the other. To your right, you will see Plasmodium mosquito and an Anopheles mosquito and Plasmodium microbe that transmits malaria. They're not threatened, but I want you to try to convince anyone they should be conserved and should be preserved for conservation purposes. In this case, again, threat and priority have nothing to do. In this case, people would all argue and fight for the extermination of these two, drive them to extinction, extinguish them completely because they affect human survival. So it's important to keep in mind that extinction risk and priority setting are two completely different processes, though they are connected. Now, all the work that we do in the IUCN falls within what we call the species conservation cycle. Assess, plan, act, network, and communicate. Those are the 5 things that we do. All of the groups of SSC, when they write their annual plans, they write them following these 5 boxes. By assessment, we usually mean things like assessing species for the red list or some other scientific assessment of other phenomena. By plan, we usually refer to developing an action plan. So take this information from the red list and turn it into a publication that allows you to think about what needs to be spent and how and invested and so on. What are the actions that are needed to reverse extinction? Act means mobilizing the resources to implement these action plans. And we had a grant system with National Geographic a while ago where they funded actions present in SSC action plans. But one thing that we find that is very interesting to me about the species conservation cycle is that when you go from assessment to action, you go from global to local. And that's where we come back to what I was saying before, where the national red lists are so important, and interacting with the IUCN members is so important for SSC, is because we need the level that we work as scientists is detached from the level that we work as practitioners. And our role is to try to connect the two. So it's find the ways that our science can influence. And a lot of the stuff that we do, that we have been doing since I'm chair of SSC, is to make this connection. And this connection was, when you ask the SSC leadership, the leaders of all those groups that I show the logos of, they say to you, or they said to me, we know how to do red listing, we know how to assess and reassess, we understand the value of that, but we want to be remembered for being the people who saved the species, not the people who listed the species. And saving is action, is not assessment. So that's has really influenced the way that we as SSC have worked in the last few years. Now, I won't tell you anything about the SSC strategic plan, only that I will leave the slides with Duan, and happy to share them with anyone. There's a visualization tool that lets you look at the global level, different countries, what we do. It's a fun thing. Feel free to explore it at your leisure. But the things that we're working, this is my second term as chair. I started in 2016, and we get 2 terms maximum, 4-year terms. I got an extra year thanks to COVID. And these are the things you will see when you look at these priorities for the current 4 years. You will see that there's not much in terms of saving species. It's all more internal operational things. And the reason why is because I think all of these things in the end are saving species as well. So for example, diversify the leadership and membership of SSC groups. We have a membership that is European, male, old. Those are the kind of the 3 primary characteristics. So, how do we get all the other voices on the table? A good friend used to say, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. And we want to get people on the table to make sure that the voices are listened. And we do better conservation by hearing all the voices. We do better conservation. We have a taxonomic and geographic gaps that we have to fill, as you could see, mostly vertebrate specialist groups. We want to emphasize the national level. Like I also mentioned, action happens at the national level. I will talk a little bit more about these centers of species survival in a second, which are a strategy that we have developed to mobilize resources. And then, it's I have 2 years left as chair, so I want to make sure that there's a smooth transition to the next one, and that my team that works with me have a future, either with the next chair or in some other pursuit. So those are the things that we're focusing on at present. We have worked a lot with trying to improve the gender balance and the leadership of SSC. When I started, we had 72% male leaders. Now it's 62%. That means that about 180 more women involved in leadership of the commission than we had before. We haven't solved it, but we have improved it. The membership, the age of the members, as you can see, sort of distributed mostly in the middle age groups. But what you can see, which I think is more interesting, is that the number of younger people in the lowest age class has increased more than any other age class. And that is because we really have had a policy, an active policy, to bring in younger talent into the commission. And I won't go into all the details of how we did that, but it's just a few maybe later on. Now, the other challenge that we confront that is related to everything that I've been saying so far is what we call the biodiversity paradox. So these maps illustrate the number of species of birds per country in the world in the top left. Top right, the number of members in the IUCN commissions by country. Bottom left, the number of IUCN member organizations. So that first class in my first graph. And then the bottom right is the per capita GDP of the countries of the world. Now this map, it's hard to look at it here, but if you look at this table, this has the top 15 in each one of those 4 graphs, the top 15. On the left is the number of species per country. On the right is the per capita GDP. You'll notice 0 overlap between the two. There's where the more the species are, fewer the resources. And the ones in the middle, the only overlap are India, Brazil, China, and Mexico, who are just such gigantic countries that they're powerful in any dimension that you measure them. And this is just the same two columns synthesized graphically. So this is something that we, as SSC, is a big challenge ahead, something that we have to work with and improve the representation of all these different voices where most species are found. Now, the two strategies that we're applying to do that, one of them is the Centers of Species Survival that I just mentioned a few seconds ago. Another one is National Species Specialist Groups. So in addition to these taxonomic groups that we have before, we're starting to create National Species Specialist Groups. We have so far created 6. You can see at the top right there, China, Colombia, Indonesia, Kenya, Madagascar, and Singapore, the 6 National Species Specialist Groups that exist. There are a few more in process. And on the in blue are the Centers of Species Survival. All those logos, it's 18 organizations. They're mostly zoos and aquariums, not all. And they join the SSC to help us support the network. You will see that there's a lot of these centers are in the north, and the National Species Specialist Groups are in the sort of global south. And we're just trying to mobilize resources from these places with more to places with fewer. Now, just keep in mind one of these centers, well, there are two. Well, I talked about one. The Indianapolis Zoo is the global center of species survival. It's our biggest center. It has 10 people that work directly with us. And then the New Mexico Biopark is one that I want to come back at the end that may be especially relevant to you. Now, these national species specialists, what they do is they bring together expertise at the national level. So, or when we have SSC members in a country, we ask them to join forces and work for the country. Usually they wouldn't do that. They'd be working for a taxonomic group, more abstract, but this brings them together to work at the national level. For me, the biggest benefit to it is at the bottom, which is that it opens the door to young talent. Because SSC is an expert network, some of the chairs will not invite someone to join until they are a global expert. And that takes a decade or two of professional work. So this opens the door for people who are earlier into the career and allows them to join. The other big advantage of this that I forgot to write up is that they work in their own languages. So they join the SSC and work in their own language. When we created the China Species Specialist Group, within 2 weeks, we had doubled the number of people in China working with SSC because we had a whole bunch of young people who didn't speak English joining the SSC as experts. So it helps us diversify the network, and it helps us bring in younger talent, which for me are two very important situations. This slide is slightly outdated. It's missing 2023, but this just shows a very rapid growth in this strategy. In this strategy, now we're up to 18 of these centers. What we ask people to do is, is to hire at least one full-time person to work directly with my team. So they become effectively, we call it SSC Chair's office staff. They're hired by others. They work with their own priorities, but they work associated to our specialist groups. So I have a team of 10 people that work with me directly, and of 40 people who work for these different organizations. So my team has gone from 10 to 50. When I started, it was 3 people on the team. Now we have 50 people that work hired by others, paid by others, also supporting their own organizations. But it's a really interesting synergy, a mutually beneficial interaction, very successful model. And we're very happy that this is happening because it's bringing in a lot of capacity that we didn't have to support the network of SSC. So these are the 2 strategies that we're using to strengthen the biodiversity paradox, the National Species Specialist Groups and the Centers for Species Survival. One thing that we also are part of, and I won't speak at all about this, is Reverse the Red. I invite you to look up reversethered.org. It's a movement that tries to mobilize these national networks. And one event that we're organizing next year, that's wrong, it's not 7 February, it's 7 May. This event is a World Species Congress. It's a 24-hour event. Typically an IUCN meeting, the World Conservation Congress, will have 20,000 people attend, more or less, 20,000, 15,000. We are aiming for, 100 million people to attend in this case. If we have it distributed throughout the world, It's online. It starts in India at 9 a.m. on May 7th, and then it moves west until it comes all the way around the next morning to the other side of India. Then we have the opportunity to have slices of 2-hour or 3-hour programs throughout a 24-hour program. And then people can join at whatever time is more convenient. We can focus the issues discussed in each time zone to what is more relevant to the people there. We can speak in their languages. We can do lots of things to really be attractive and inclusive. So we're aiming for a massive audience, truly participatory. And this is another kind of effort that we're trying to internationalize the SSC. The second part of my talk, in the last part of my talk, is about conservation success stories. These two publications and these are publications where lots of SSC members have been involved in different ways. The one on the right, Second Nature, is a book that you can download for free there at that address there. The one on the left is a beautiful big coffee table book with fantastic photographs, which you cannot download, but you can buy at a reasonable price in Amazon and other places. But both of them came out in 2017, and both of them tell us stories about conservation success. We'll start out in Mauritius. Mauritius is a model extinction island. It's a model extinction island because virtually everything that was native there went extinct, or almost went extinct as a consequence of human action, but many species have recovered as well. And 3 of these are the Mauritius kestrel, the pink pigeon, and the echo parakeet. All 3 were the most something, and I'll tell you what they were and what happened to them. So the Mauritius kestrel was down to 4 individuals. The rarest bird in the world in the 1970s. You may know from your studies that DDT was a big threat to what they're called, I'm blanking, birds of prey, because they affect the metabolism of calcium. So the eggs were very brittle, and they would just lay eggs, and the fledglings would die. And they didn't have enough nest sites. So this organization, which is the Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust in the UK, went on to save them. They, of course, DDT was phased out, so that helped them. But also they went very actively into captive breeding. They did double clutching, which is, the pair lays eggs, they take the eggs out, raise them in an incubator, and then release the birds and teach them how to hunt and so on. So by 2017, the rarest bird in the world was up to 250, 300 and living in the wild. The rarest pigeon in the world was down to about 9 to 10 birds. Similar kind of combination of threats, a little bit different, but they had exotic invasive species that were predating on the eggs and predating on the adults. Again, the people at Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust bred them in captivity, raised them, controlled the cats, who were the ones eating the adults, controlled the mongooses, who were the ones eating, the rats are the ones eating the eggs, and now the bird has 7 populations in Mauritius. The echo parakeet, the rarest parrot in the world. Similar story, lots of threats, combination of threats. They dealt with the threats, and now it's up to 650, 700. The reason I bring up these examples is that because it would have been really easy to say, we can't do anything about this. It's down to 4 birds, just like, forget it. We're not going to spend any money. We're not going to spend any time. Just let them go. And that is certainly something that comes up in many conservationist minds. When do you give up? When do you just don't make any more effort? And this just shows that, evidence-based, scientifically designed, well thought out, premeditated plans can save species. And it can save them even in the worst of circumstances, when they're down to few individuals and there are many, many threats affecting them. But if you learn about the threats, you think about how to control them, it can be reversed. And that's really the key message of my presentation today, is that. But it's not only birds. What is a phasmid? Who knows what a phasmid is? Stick insect. This is not really a stick insect. It's like a hot dog insect, because it's about this big and this big around. And in fact, it's so kind of juicy and meaty that rats love to eat them. So when a ship ran aground, and they live in Lord Howe Island, which is between Australia and New Zealand, so in that area, a ship landed there. The rats got out of the ship and it was a tiny little island. They had these stick insects there, and they were gone. Within a couple of years, they ate up all the stick insects, and it was declared extinct. A few years later, 100 years later, almost 80 years later, it was rediscovered in another one of these little islands nearby. Some intrepid scientists went up and collected a few. There were maybe 40 of them left in the wild. They collected 2 pairs. Of the 2 pairs, 1 pair died, so they were down to 1 pair. And this pair is now the origin of 13,500 or more of these Lord Howe insects that are in 3 zoological collections in Australia and the UK. So again, down to 2 individuals, and the species has been saved. Now they are restoring an island to reintroduce them and release them there. Arabian oryx, another example, I'm not going to go into details, was declared extinct in the wild. It only existed in private collections throughout different parts of the world, in some zoos and some private collections in the Arabian Peninsula and nearby areas. And now, it's an animal with some individuals free living, many of them in captivity, but again, international global effort of rescuing the species and is recovered. There are many examples. I won't go into more. Go get those books and look at them. Many examples of species that have been recovered. And I just want to close with one example that I'm very familiar with. An example of a species that we work with in Venezuela, Provita, the conservation organization that I'm involved with, started working on the yellow-shouldered parrot in the 1980s, late 80s. And it's a unique species in the sense that it's the Amazon parrots tend to be of humid forests, of wet forests in the tropics, in the Americas. And this one is adapted to arid ecosystem, so thorny, kind of acacia-looking vegetation. They nest in holes that are formed naturally in large trees, and they're endangered nationally. I'm just going to start by the end of the story, but when we started in the 1980s, there were about 700 or 750 of them in the wild on Margarita Island, which is, I'll show you where it is in a second. And now they're about 2,000, and that's just a consequence of sustained work over these 3 decades. That's where the species used to be and is. In orange are the locations where we think there might be wild populations. In green are the places where we know there are wild populations. Margarita Island is where we work. They're at the top right. They also are in La Blanquilla Island and Bonaire. They've been there for a while. And in Curacao, we think there's a feral population that has established itself from released animals that escaped, confiscated animals that have escaped into the island. We work mostly in a very small part of the island, the Macanao Peninsula, 300 square kilometers. There on the left, on the eastern part, on the western part of the island. And this is what that habitat looks like. It's short little trees, very thorny, lots of cactuses. And there in the middle of the slide is a barren area. That's what the sand mines, the mining activities of extraction of sand leave. You can see some like broken pieces. Anyway, the big trees where they nest grow in these little creeks, seasonal creek beds. And when you take the sand out, you take the trees out. So we have an effect. They're both very good pets. And we, in fact, have been working on that a lot recently in the social sciences behind why people have pets, why people have these parrots. And we have found that in this case, it is mostly the men work as fishermen, and they go off in 3 or 4 months a year, or 3 or 4 months at a time. And then they leave a parrot behind to accompany the family. So the parrot is not just a pet, it's a family member. I'm sure some women think that they're better companions than their husbands, but the parrots stay with the family when the men are away. So it's a complicated dynamic that we're just now starting to understand and working on that. But one of the biggest threats also is the habitat conversion by the extraction of sand for construction that happens at these dry creek beds. That's Virginia Sanz, one of our scientists. She's been working on the parrot for a long time, and that's what a nest looks like. That's a really accessible nest. Usually they're not so easy to get to. But if you look inside, I think the next one that's what they look like in the inside, the parrots. This year is the first year in history that we have recorded 7 parrots, 7 eggs and 7 fledglings coming out of it. It never happened before. And that you can imagine, if these 4 look crowded, imagine 7, or what it looks like. And these are foster nests. We call them foster nests because the one that I just mentioned was a natural nest of 7 fledglings, but usually they have fewer eggs. And usually we bring them all up to 5. So we take parrots from nests that are high risk, that we cannot protect, and bring them to foster nests, take them all to 5, and then they raise them no problem. The nests get damaged by poachers when they take the fledglings out, so we fix the nests, and then the parrots come back, no problem. We used to use these boxes, not successful at all. We switched to these artificial nests, which are either PVC pipes or natural branches that we just chop off from places where they have been damaged, and then rebuild them and put them back up. Very successful. Now we hang these nests anywhere, and the parrots lay eggs. We use a technique called partial captive breeding for a while, which we invented. We were desperate at some stage of the project, and every single night we would take all the fledglings out of the nest into boxes, put them in a safe location, and then every morning put them back in to prevent the poaching, because we didn't have enough staff to. And that was, we'll talk about a little bit more about that. We have released confiscated birds. We raised them in captivity. We put radio collars on them, demonstrated that they adapted and joined the population and bred, and everything is fine. And our key really tool has been local guys who used to be poachers and became conservationists. Now this group is much bigger. It has both men and women, and they're very, very active. They devote 6 months of a year to this, 24 hours a day, protecting nests. Their inspiration is Pablo Antonio Millán, who never finished elementary school, is a fantastic artist and naturalist. He's been the one who's trained all of us into this. He also paints and is a nationally known naive painting artist. Great inspiration, Pablo Antonio. And we've had some of my students develop techniques of habitat restoration. So we're working on every possible dimension that we can. We had vets oversee the health status, and we do, at the end of each year, we conclude the season with a festival that celebrates the success of a year, and it's just a big event with lots of song and dance and poetry and music written for the festival every year. Really fantastic. So lots of things. We've done lots of things. We tried, tried. So what happened with all those things? Well, we started measuring the results of these in 2004. We were like, this is great. Look at that. In 2 years, we took, the poaching from 60%, 40% fledged. We took it from 60% poaching to 0 in 2 years. We must be like superstar conservationists. Well, the next year we lost 50% of the birds to one single poaching event in that secure facility where we took all the birds at night to protect them. So we took them there. Some guys came with guns, and of course they took them. The instruction to our team was never ever confront anyone that is armed. So we lost half the parrots in one night, and we said, well, maybe we have to rethink our strategy. So we started trying different things, and we have reached now finally stability. We learned, we know how to grow parrots. We know how to do it. We do it well. We have produced the line at the bottom, which you can't see very well. It's in gray. It shouldn't be in gray, but it doesn't matter. You can see, if you can see it, the numbers are always 2 digits, 2 digits, 2 digits, 2 digits, until 2018, when we produced 128, 226, 140, 140, 202, 202. This year's 206. So we learned, we know how to do it. We learned how to grow parrots. We went through bad times, but this is an important lesson of conservation. You have to try things, you have to fail, you have to try again and keep trying until you do it. And now I think that the next challenge that we're going to have is not so much how to raise parrots, but how to deal with the people, because these parrots are going to start eating fruit trees and other cultivated plants. So what do we do now? What do we do in the next stage? But we learned how to save parrots. And it took a while, but we're there. Now, what the one wanted me to close with some thoughts about what can you do? What's next? What can we do? What can you do in your region? What can you do with existing institutions? How do we make this grow locally? Well, the first thing is that, you know, all these different tools that I mentioned, the red list of species, ecosystem, KVAs, etc., they are applicable locally. So it's perfectly reasonable to think of a red list of the Southwest, or a red list of whatever. You know, the geographic dimension is up to you, what the priorities may be, what the interest may be. So that's worthwhile thinking about whether there are interests of application of these tools locally. And like I said before, I think the strength of these is in combining them into single tools that bring species, ecosystem, protected areas into the same perspective. Now, you have one of these centers of species survival very close by in Albuquerque, or closer by than most people do. They're one of our best centers, and I don't mean that because the others are no good, but because they provide services to others. So they have grown into a hub, a training hub. They train red listing. They provide support to many different taxonomic groups. Ian Harrison, who's here in the audience, and my steering committee has worked with them a lot. So you can ask him about it. And it is really an important group. I think that they have 3 people hired now. They're planning to go to 5. So it's a resource, a big resource, very, very well versed in the work that we do, and very influential. So, you know, reach out to them. And then for those of you that are younger, we just created about 2 weeks ago the Young Professional Task Force. 2 people run it, Sakina, who's in Algeria, and Jimmy, who's in Malaysia. And they are bringing together younger talent into SSC. They're trying to figure out, how do we do with people who are not yet global experts in a theme, but want to contribute? You know, what kinds of things you can work on. So this is a very new effort. It just has 2 weeks or 3 weeks since we established it. But if you're interested, I invite you to reach out to them and explore and help us think about, you know, what do you want out of such a group, and how can we make that happen? I just want to conclude thanking all the many people who support our network. We really depend, all of the work that we do is mostly externally funded. A very small proportion of the funds of the SSC come from the IUCN itself. Most of them come from people like these, who either provide funding or give us services, benefits, things that we can use. None of my team is, you know, all the team that I mentioned depends on these organizations. So it's a truly cooperative, distributed effort that we have. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Yes.
So I have 2 questions. So probably they somebody else. What are your plans for how there is a need to integrate genetic factors into the conservation biologists using molecular tools?
I'll repeat your question, and then so people in Zoom can. So I'll repeat it, and then you can do the second one after that. So the first question was about genetic data and how that can be integrated into some of these analyses and some of these tools. We have a conservation genetics specialist group. So there's one group that focuses on that. They do lots of things. There's a huge interest now on environmental DNA, and how do you use those data to help us with assessments of biodiversity, distribution, species presence, etc. So that's one branch that is growing very quickly. The other one is, so the red list categories are focused on demographic data primarily. So it's mostly distribution and abundance of species, and some questions about sexual maturity, reproductive capacity of the population. So those are the main things that we focus on. But there is no criterion based on genetics. And the reason is because there is no clear link between genetics and extinction risk. There's no operational It hasn't been operationalized. And there are people working on that now, thinking of how do you make, what genetic traits increase extinction risk, and how do you bring that into the red list? So there are some people thinking about that now. If you have any ideas, very welcome, because those are the kind of the two areas. And then the third one is the green status is one new, and I'm sure there are more, but these are the three that I can think of now. Green status is a new tool within the red list that is for focusing, for assessing conservation success and for guiding future investments. It's more complicated than that, but overall. And one requirement of the green status is to divide the global population into subpopulations, subunits that are meaningful for whatever reason. One of them is to divide them geographically. We're working now on culture as another way to divide them into different dialects that animals speak. And the third one is genetics. So some populations may be delimited better by genetic characteristics rather than others. So those are the directions that genetics has taken that I can think of now. Your second question.
Is that I'm Mexican and I'm very worried about the vaquita.
Yeah.
And I presented like success stories that vaquita is like it can be failed for story. And this is because they don't really captivity. And we have the shiny like black mark. So you have an idea, you have like
yeah, no, vaquita, we have worked a lot on vaquita, and there's a specialist group, a cetacean specialist group that is especially leading in that theme. And I have written many letters to the Mexican government, informed by them, and part of global movements. So the vaquita is a case, is a kind of case where we don't want to get to. We want to try to avoid getting to. And by that, I mean, we work a lot with zoos and aquariums. And the reason why we don't know how to breed vaquitas is because we never tried until there were 10 vaquitas left. And imagine that zoos and aquariums have started working on reproduction of vaquita 30 years ago when there were hundreds of them. And then we would know how to do it. Now they have captured a few and they die because they don't know what to do with them. And it's lack of knowledge, lots of experience. And it's possible that a better, so I'm a big fan of having all the conservation tools at your service, accessible. And zoos and aquariums have a big role to play. Not all of them do, but some of them do. And the vaquita is something that we're now working on extreme urgency. Poaching has not stopped. Controlling the nets and the different capture techniques has not stopped, but it's getting a little bit better. Recently, there were a few more seen than before. The acoustic monitoring is showing a little bit of hope. So it's one of these cases that we really want to avoid getting there, because once you get there, it's really hard to get out. And at this point, all we're hoping is that there's an increasing, I don't know if the word is interest, but awareness, at least from the Mexican government, and hopefully, at this point, all we can do is hope and keep pushing strategies. But the vaquita is very tragic and is the most threatened of all vertebrates in the world. Thank you.
other questions?
The 1, 2. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. The question is, how do we make this happen? How do we take this knowledge about how to save species and actually save species? Well, I think there are more than one answer to that question. But if you look, they have people who have examined what would have happened if we hadn't done any conservation. So there's a counterfactual study done with the world's ungulates, with all the sheep and related wild animals and all of those. And what that study demonstrated was that we have not reversed the trend, but we have slowed it down a lot. So we have certainly slowed down. There would be like 30% or 40% more extinct or threatened ungulates if we hadn't done a whole bunch of conservation action over the last 20 or 30 years. And a second study that was more recent, it showed the same thing for other species of vertebrates, for birds and others. So we are doing so much more money is being spent on destroying nature than on saving nature, that's what we're losing. We're losing in priorities and investment, and the environment. Conservation is seen as an obstacle to development rather than as an ally to development. So I think that the moves toward nature-based solutions and emphasizing that nature also has a role to play in our well-being, more material, quantitative, not just the spiritual or other effects, I think is the only way to do it. And also, when a red list, so the red list gets updated 2 or 3 times a year typically. When you read the press release that IUCN produces, that drives me crazy, is always about how much worse we are than before. So the headline always is the last right whale seen sinking into the bottom of the ocean. That's the headline. And we do that all the time. We have this perception that, these terrible news are what going to get people motivated. And I disagree with that completely. I think it's the good news what are going to get people motivated. So I keep changing those press releases when they get to my hands, and then they change them back, and that's that. But there are enough people within the IUCN and the Red List world that are starting to push that agenda. And I think being more positive in that we can do it, and that's why I called it the talk I gave it this title, because I want to communicate that it's not that we don't know, it's not that we are losing the battle because we are ignorant. It's because the forces are much bigger on the other side. But that can change, and it can only change through us being aware of it and pushing in that direction. It's kind of a soft answer, but I think that's the only way. There was one back there. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, sure. So the question is about the indirect impact of first world economies on third world resources in some way. How will you export your impact by being able to afford doing that? And that's a serious problem. I mean, you look at countries like Netherlands, who are perhaps one of the most environmentally aware citizens in the world, and then they don't produce anything that they consume, or very few things, and they have a massive ecological footprint on their economies. And that is, a big focus of many of the discussions. And not only that, but subsidies. I mean, the value of the fish caught in the world is less than the fish caught in the world. so they just get subsidized so heavily that the business is to spend the subsidies rather than to sell the fish. And those examples like those, there are many everywhere. So that's a big challenge, and it's very hard to it's very hard to address because it is kind of diffuse and it's hidden and it's not explicit. And it's definitely the focus on, when you look at any of the, when you look at the IUCN position paper for the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties, which is going to be in December in Dubai, the first line, the first in Abu Dhabi. The first message is, stop harmful subsidies. So it's very clear that that's a big driver, and we're pushing it very hard, but it's very hard to convince people to do that. So I think ultimately it comes down to, citizens that are informed and interested and try to influence the governments.
I have a question online.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, yes, the question is about diet and human choices. About diet, he refers to veganism as a controversial behavior. I'm not sure that many people would agree that it's controversial behavior, but anyway, it certainly raises controversy, no question about that. So I think it's all a matter, for me, it's all a matter of balance. So, you could be a vegan living in Alaska. Well, you probably couldn't in Alaska, but let's say in northern US, and your footprint in terms of energy use is gigantic. In the winter, you need to have massive amounts of energy to heat your home. In the summer, you have to have massive amount of energy to cool your home. And then you're vegan, and your perception is that you're having a smaller impact on the world, and you're not. You're having a massive impact by choosing where you live. So for me, it's not so much about a single choice, but is a awareness of all your impact. And I think that we all should do things like, reduce, recycle, all that stuff, all the R's. I think that, it's important that if you're going to be a meat eater, try to minimize the impact of that by selecting more sustainably grown, more locally sourced. I mean, there are many options. I think we have at our reach many options to minimize our impact on Earth. And I don't think it's just about one or the other. It's about all of them together. And yeah, so that's from an environmental perspective, the best thing would probably be that we all lived in the plains in Kenya and Laikipia, where humans came from, and we don't need, heating or cooling or dress, basically, because you're more or less the same temperature, a decent temperature all year round. But that's not the way we are. So we have to think about how do we minimize our impact. Choose renewable energies. Whatever. There are lots of things that we can do that reduce our footprint, and I think the key for me is in that, more than about choosing one specific element of your lifestyle to justify your awareness. More. Yeah.
The issue of environmental protection is very what's up to think that take part of the waste
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, the question is, how do you get local communities and people whose values might not include conservation, who might perceive that conservation as a Western concept that is not relevant to their life? How do you get those people interested and engaged? And we were having a conversation before this presentation about persuading people. And my experience, at least, is that the worst way to persuade people is to tell them that they're doing something wrong. That just doesn't go anywhere. Or to punish them, like put them in jail or fine them or hit them or whatever it is that you do to punish people. I think, incentives are much better, and listening is much better. So if you can find ways to reward good behavior, or the behavior you think is good or you discuss, the way to get to recognizing what good behavior is listening to what people think. So what I said before, that we want to diversify the leadership and the membership of SSC, we don't diversify that. It's a little bit of being on the menu. We don't diversify that to fulfill a quota. Is to have so many, so many people from this region or that gender or this age. That's not the point. The point is that unless you hear all those voices, you get it wrong. You just don't get the right answer. The only way to get the right answer is to hear all the voices and figure out the common values. And I'm sure that any people from any culture, if they spend enough time, maybe drink enough beer together, they will find common points. It might not be all points, it might be some few, but there's certainly, I'm convinced that there's always is somewhere that you can start. But the only way to get there is by listening and talking. So it's slow and it's ineffective and inefficient, and sometimes it takes many attempts, but I don't see any other way to do it.
Thank you, Jon Paul, and I think that last response highlights some of the conservation challenges I've seen in this area where we don't that's what people, that's what environmentalists do, and I think the same principle applies. So on that note, thank you all for coming. There's no beer, unfortunately, but there is some coffee and other drinks and some snacks. And then for those students in EMB 555, we'll start walking over at 5:30 to our classroom in the geology building. And before that, everyone has a chance to talk to Jon Paul or talk to each other. Thank you.
Thank you.